This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Welcome to the James Bond Book Club. Hosted by me, John Bleasdale. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the James Bond Book Club. We are continuing today with the James Bond continuation novels. We've already done a couple, Kingsley Amis's Colonel Sun and Anthony Horowitz we looked at in the last episode. But this episode, we're actually going back to probably one of the most important of the continuation novels. It's 1981. And John Gardner has been asked to bring back James Bond in the book License Renewed. And joining me, or I should say rejoining me, to discuss this novel is Dr. Brian Baker. Welcome back, Brian.
I'm very honoured to be back in the seat, John.
It's
not the ejector seat.
I shall. Yeah, everybody thinks it's not the ejector seat until they realise it is. So, to just give a little bit of context to the novel and the publication of the novel, well, let me just ask one question before I do that, which is this your first time reading this novel, or did you read it prior to the podcast?
No, it's the first time I've read any Gardner, actually. I've never been particularly interested in the continuation novels, except for Amis, but that's because it's in the period, really. So no, this was my first exposure to Gardner's art, and it's an interesting experience.
Okay, that's a good. I'm glad we've got you sort of fresh, so to speak. So let me give you a little bit of context, which is essentially this is the beginning of a long run by Gardner. He's going to do 14 novels in the series. He has been approached by what will become the Ian Fleming Publishing Company, but at the time is called Guild Rose Publications, who hold the copyright for James Bond and 007. And he's been asked to do this continuation novel. And his sort of pitch and proposal is that James Bond has Rip Van Winkled through the 70s and 60s and 70s, essentially since Colonel Sun, and has arrived in the 80s at basically the same age as he was in the 50s, and is ready to reassume his role at the same age. So there's no sense that he's realistically aged with the period. And you have all the furniture, if you like, of the James Bond novels. You have the M and the Q section and everything else in place. But it's very much also an updating in terms of plot and in terms of, I think there are some real differences here. But at the same time, there's obviously an attempt to retain or replicate a sort of classical Bond-like structure, about Bond-like narrative. Let's talk first of all about that element of, because I think it's one of the most striking elements now of reading the novel is how the 1980s kind of play a big role in the book.
Yeah, I suppose the key thing is the issue of nuclear power and nuclear weapons, I suppose. Which, as someone who was in the early 1980s, someone who did go on marches to US air bases in the UK, it was very, very important issue in terms of the late Cold War. And also therefore kind of bled over into debates about nuclear power, and therefore kind of debates we have now about resource security. Where Russian pipelines of gas and oil and the ending of coal as an energy fuel. It has interesting resonances, I thought. This idea of nuclear power being the thing which is the thing that will be the vulnerability for the Cold War state, in a sense, really is not nuclear weapons, as is in, I don't know, kind of Octopussy, a couple of years later in the films, but it's nuclear power station, and you've got those references, haven't you, to the China Syndrome, which was 79, I think, was it China Syndrome? The kind of film, and that's very clearly haunting the entire novel, isn't it? It kind of goes back to that. Repeatedly. So it's interesting, I think, in terms of where it's situated with regard to that very, very early 80s kind of cultural.
Yeah, absolutely. The initial title of the novel when it was first submitted was Meltdown, which would have made that point even more specifically. I think Thunderball as well had nuclear weapons at the center of its sort of, and so as you say, that's more nuclear weapons than this one, which is as you were mentioning, it's more the power infrastructure of nuclear power stations. The idea that you always have in the films with the continuation of James Bond as a character as he passes through the 80s and the 90s is also this idea that he's always going to be a little bit old-fashioned. I mean, even think in Goldfinger, there's a line where Sean Connery, I think it's very much seen as a big mistake in the film, where he talks about, it's almost as bad as listening to the Beatles without earmuffs. And it's sort of like, oh dear, Grandad. But it's kind of like, the cool thing is going to be to dismiss pop because pop is for kids and this is more a mature sort of idea. But actually, pop became the art form, and James Bond was a part of that. But nevertheless, going into the 80s and the 90s, James Bond has become very established. He has a whole history, and so every sort of novel that comes afterwards and every film that comes afterwards kind of has to deal with this. Why are we bothering with this now? What more does this have to add? How relevant is Bond to the world today?
There's this really interesting moment in the novel, isn't there, where Bond is taken to Lavender's flat and there's some kind of weird Sonne Lumiere thing going on, which turns her apartment into something from the 1960s, and she kind of and a kind of projected version of her comes out, wearing some kind of negligee, and it's like, oh my god, it's Bond from 1965 literally projected into this kind of space of the kind of the early 1980s. It's such a fascinating thing for him to have done, because it's a real nudge to the reader, isn't it? It's like, oh, we know the history of Bond here, and we know that he's a bit antediluvian. But kind of we have to kind of play a little game with ourselves, which is that old Bond hasn't really aged, but really he is part of that older world. He really is part of the 60s, and that's what she understands gets him revved up. That he's really part of the 60s. It's like, oh yeah, come on then, James. This will kind of get you going. Here's the waterbed,
Well, yeah, it's like, I mean, it is like, and I don't mean this facetiously at all, but it is like the scene in Austin Powers when he's literally been frozen in time, and he has to get Burt Bacharach and everybody back together to feel in any way comfortable. He needs that context, otherwise he really doesn't make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's kind of it's a version of that Playboy bachelor pad, which was kind of this kind of cultural emblem in the late 50s and 60s. It's this idea of kind of masculinity, so he'll have these jazz records, and it's much more Glenn Dayton actually in a way, isn't it? He'll have a coffee pot and all that kind of stuff, and it's a kind of seduction pad in a way. Everything is set up there for the ladies.
Absolutely. But at the same time, you have to have these structures and these things which are sort of the Umberto Eco version of James Bond, which are the sort of atavistic fairy tale narrative. And here I think Gardner is actually really good. I think I really like the fact that he takes him back to Scotland, for instance, and there's a sense of that. I think that whole sequence in Scotland is really good. It really makes sense. It has a atmospherics that, you know, there's a castle and there's a fairy tale element to it. You know, it's like the Baron, basically, the evil Baron. There's a gothicness
Yes.
which lies
Yeah.
behind it. There's a henchman, you know. And you could see how this, I think as well, that there's a sort of a real pleasure in the book in sort of seeing the writer having one eye on Hollywood and a potential, you know, why don't you make this one next? This one's available. This one hasn't been
Yes.
filmed.
Yeah. Although there are elements almost of Moonraker, aren't there? Because the kind of Murak is a bit of a Drax-like character, and the kind of the film Moonraker, of course, 79, and then going to the castle in this fairy tale, kind of in the middle of nowhere with some bad map photography. That kind of is part of the vibe, isn't it? When he goes to this part of Scotland, it's kind of, as you say, it's part fantasy, part Hollywood, and part triggering memories of other kind of narratives. As you say, there's a kind of semiotic overload. We kind of it's very textual.
Right, exactly. Yes, yeah, absolutely. And the other film that it reminded me of as well is the Pierce Brosnan "The World Is Not Enough," which also has a sort of I think this is a nuclear submarine or something, which is being, which is, you know, and it's also Sophie Marceau's character is this person who seems to be an innovative and alternative sort of business leader with a fortune, and then turns out to be somebody who's actually using her wealth for nefarious ends. Spoiler for The World Is Not
You're
Enough.
going to use that word. Nefarious. That was definitely going to be next.
That was, yeah. Using the fortune for.
Exactly.
Okay, we've resisted for long enough. We have to talk about the most 80s element of the book, which is the Silver Beast, as it is as it is called, the Saab, which he drives, the Saab 900 Turbo, which off mic we'd spent about 15 minutes talking about already, but I think it's worth giving the listeners the benefit of our nostalgic joy at this this particular car being given to Bond.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a European car, isn't it? I think that kind of it's there's a kind of idea that there's an access to a new kind of European reality going on. I'm thinking about when 81 is kind of when Mitterrand gets elected, and because it's very unusually for a Bond novel, this is not a transatlantic novel, is it? There's very little presence of the Americans.
He doesn't go to
or
Jamaica
America per se. That's also true.
He does in like
but
7 out of 8 of the Fleming novels.
Yeah, no, exactly. But the plane ends up circling the Mediterranean at the end, and so in a sense, its pitch seems to be much less transatlantic than some of the other than the Fleming novels in a way, which always have America and as you know, I suppose the dominant world power in you know kind of in Fleming's view as part of the kind of the ideological fabric of the whole story, whereas they're on the margins here. And so, in a sense, the Saab is quite a kind of interesting nod to the changing kind of geopolitical landscape in a way that is neither the Bentley nor the Aston Martin nor some other muscle car that you might want to drive from the States. You know, so kind of it's a kind of high end consumer car.
What country is Saab coming from? Is it German?
Sweden.
Sweden, right?
Sweden. Yeah, they also make jets.
Right,
fighter jets,
right, of course, yeah,
the Gun and the Draken, yeah. So kind of, yeah, they make glories and everything else, you know. Saab, they're huge, kind of. But even now, I think Saab now are part of a much wider pan-European, you know, kind of conglomerate of car makers now. So kind of, but then they were, yeah, this kind of slightly cutting edgy, slightly kind of, you know. They're trendy, funky kind of things, like driving an Alfa Romeo or something. You know, there's a kind of, he's not driving a Fiat.
Yeah, it reminded me. My uncle drove a Saab, and he was like a doctor, and so he was by far the sort of wealthiest member of the family. And the Saab was definitely a sign of conspicuous consumption. It was definitely a like, wow, I'd almost sort of compare it to maybe having a Tesla today. There was an element of this was really, now it feels really old fashioned, but then it felt really, cutting edge.
Exactly. He should have had a Volvo, really, shouldn't he? He could have got a lot of equipment in the back of a 144.
Yeah,
Kind of
could have got a body
pack
in
all
there.
the gadgets in, and a couple of grandfather clocks and a tent. Yeah.
Um, so when we getting into the story as such, I mean, we've already mentioned how sort of every film or every book that's post Fleming has to contend with the fact that the world is changing, he is changing, and the book starts with this very interesting idea, which is the double O section has essentially been retired, and Bond is on a mission which is much more to do with being M's personal troubleshooter, which is in a way
Blunt instrument.
exactly slightly unusual, and yet reinforces that relationship that they have. I mean, M even says, "You'll always be 007 to me," and it's like when I go to bed at night, I say my prayers and I kiss a picture of you, my 007, my sweetie. It's sort of like, you know, it's okay, M. I'm not sure what to do with that.
Well, towards the end as well, where kind of Bond is trying to kind of get a few things in place. It's like, Dad, can you make a few phone calls for me? I need this, and I need this, and I need this. It's like, all right, then, son picks up the phone call again. So, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There is that kind of sense of the filial, isn't there, in a way, which it's kind of there anyway, isn't it? I suppose in the Fleming books, but it's much more central. There's a kind of indulgent quality to it, isn't it? Favoured
Exactly.
son.
Exactly, and I mean, there's this whole idea of the license renewed as well, and the license being given away. So you already have in the title the sense of, well, first of all, the license renewed as a title, it gives you a sense that the book itself is a renewal, is a coming back, and then you have the idea that the retiring of the double O section is going to be something. He's been away and he's coming back. We've not had some missions for a while, and now he's back. And so the mission that you get is this semi-official uh, situation in which Dr. Anton Murik, who is a famous physicist, nuclear physicist, who has resigned from the Atomic Energy Commission because he's of his, the fools, they don't understand me, the small-minded fools, my genius, why, stop plaguing me with these petty regular, it's health and safety gone mad. He's essentially proto UKIP, or
Yeah.
I mean, he's quite musky in that sense as well. So the billionaire who doesn't want to be tied down by regulations or other things, and behind that wish for freedom is also more nefarious ambitions.
Yeah, it's interesting as well what you said before as well, John, about the Gothic, because in sense that's a classic Gothic trope, isn't it? Frankenstein, Moreau, and in Murik, there's a kind of half pun on Moreau,
Oh
perhaps.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so kind of the idea of going to some kind of place out in the middle of nowhere where you're in control, and that's the place where, away from prying eyes, you can actually conduct these experiments. So yeah, I think kind of I mean that Munich thing has just come to me, but I think that is very definitely there as part of the kind of Gothicized, kind of thematic quality of the book.
Absolutely, and I think the whole thing about going back to a castle as well, him being the laird, it's almost like somebody, calling the previous sort of atavistic powers to somehow underwrite his more modern power. It's sort of like, oh yeah, I'm actually a baron, I'm actually a laird, so that will give me this authority. And I want the sort of Dwight de Seigneur. I want the complete. And we're seeing it today with, again, Peter Thiel and people like that who want essentially the divine right of kings to be reestablished, but for the tech bros.
Yeah. There's also, I think, kind of that kind of idea of other powers is also an interesting one. Thinking about something like the Wicker Man, another island in the middle of nowhere with a laird, and there are these strange goings on and some kind of power binding the community, which is strange rituals perhaps taking place. There's the Highland Games,
brilliant set piece, such a great.
Yes, and the henchman called Caber, which I thought was hilarious.
And you remember when tossing the caber was like a thing? As I was reading that, I was getting increasingly worried.
Still is. Yeah. Thrusting their poles high into the air.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, it's Scottish oats porridge.
Exactly. Well, yeah, he does wear a coat that actually kind of is hilarious. I think kind of when he takes Bond into the inner sanctum, he gets the key out of his sporran.
It's so funny how this is really Sean Connery's doing, because before Connery came along, Bond was Eton, and there was no implication that he was Scottish at all, and it was Ian Fleming in his craven lust to make as much money as he possibly could. He kind of retrofitted a Scottish ancestry and a Scottish background, and he was educated at Fettes after he was kicked out of Eton, and so you have this whole idea, and then the films have just picked up and run with that, regardless of the fact that the actual nationality of the actors playing Bond following this have differed quite widely as well.
Yes, no, absolutely, yeah. No, the Scottish Gambit is an interesting one. Again, it reminded me a little bit of Skyfall and that kind of turn to a kind of Gothic-sized kind of landscape with the castle and all that kind of thing. But Muir's an interesting one, isn't he? As this kind of, again, he's one of these kind of like Blofeld, almost stateless kind of figures who's not really part of a kind of national or other kind of context and seems to kind of float free.
There's something very inauthentic about his claims as well, and that's the whole point. It's again, as you say, like Blofeld sort of trying to get heraldry on his side, and there's almost something slightly pathetic about it. Okay, come on, you've got you've got quite a lot of power. Do you really need the sort of validation of something like a heraldic legacy, which is sort of completely fake?
Well, I suppose it's of a piece with his need to be validated by the nuclear, kind of scientist community, but he kind of then holds to ransom, because if he didn't really care, he'd just go off and kind of find someone else to fund his investigations and experiments. But he seems to need them to, acknowledge his genius.
Yeah, see the error of their ways.
His ultra safe reactor is the future, and their petty tin pot, kind of stuff needs to be put in the bin. So in a sense, you're right in a way, Gardner. That's quite a nice little kind of psychological connection, I suppose. That his need for validation in terms of being thought of as the proper laird, which kind of runs all the way through, doesn't it? And with the oilskin package right at the very end, that's the kind of the key motivator in a way. For him, even more so than the nuclear thing, really.
It's sort of his Achilles heel as well as his, as you say, his motivating factor. We have a bit at the very beginning, closer to the beginning, I should say. We have another sort of set piece, and I did think as I was going through this novel, this is really written as a series of set pieces. There are a series of locations. There are a series of different tasks Bond has to do. different ways he's going to do it. And I really enjoyed that aspect of it. I thought Gardner was really good at keeping up that sort of pace and keeping up it was a really exciting novel to read in that sense. I mean, it has its flaws, obviously, but there's a scene in Ascot, and you do sort of think, oh yeah, Bond in Ascot, that's nice, and it reminded me actually, to go beyond Bond for a second, of Mission Impossible 2, having a very similar scene in a horse race. I'm not sure if it's Ascot but it's Tom Cruise. Filmed by John Woo at this point, and him and his sort of crew, his team, have got to I think steal something and replace it in somebody else's pocket, and it had a similar vibe to this. But I just thought the setting of Ascot was a really good choice. It's sort of, it's there's a real genius in going, where could I put Bond which would make total sense but also be fun.
Yeah, and nabbed, of course, for Due to a Kill, which is kind of in the races, isn't it? Kind of with Chris Walken's another horse. But I was waiting for that actually. What's the kind of the trick? And of course, it's this kind of substitution thing rather than some kind of injection of super horse hormones or whatever it is that kind of propels that horse to victory. But it's gone. There's something which I connects that scene up to a whole theme, I think, in the novel, which I found fascinating. But what were you going to say?
No. I mean, that was kind of it, really. It was just that element of Ascot and the whole situation, and I kind of found it quite filmic because of how atmospheric and how, without going to what you said earlier, without going to America, without going to the West Indies or Jamaica or Brazil or anywhere, you still get a real sense of sort of globe trotting, even though you're not globe trotting, you're just sort of Europe hopping.
You're not going anywhere.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
England to Scotland.
I mean, obviously the twins feature everything. It's obviously it's the Prestige later on, isn't it? That's how the magic trick works in the Prestige. And I thought the whole book was filled with this idea of prestidigitation, of stage magic. It kind of starts off with someone changing, kind of their entire appearance and disguise, and then you have the idea of warlock, which Bond goes to the dictionary and finds out not only is some kind of magical, but also is a conjurer. And kind of there's all of these things to do with disguise, change, the kind of knocking of the pearls off in the Ascot scene. There's all these things to do with stage magic, and the whole thing is filled with this kind of idea. And I thought it was really fascinating that Garner kind of it's pretty deliberate. He's picking up these things. So when I got to the conjurer thing, and I thought, oh yeah, of course, kind of he's pointing out that's what he's doing. That there's lots of sleight of hand going on here. Twins and substitutions and disguise and so I thought that was again very cunningly kind of stitched in all of that.
And there's a lot of sort of yeah, exactly. There's a lot of kind of shows and public events. He goes to the Highland Games we've already mentioned, Ascot we've already mentioned, but at the end, yeah, absolutely, he's in the middle of an event with a large public, and he's making his way behind the stage and trying to work out where the attack is going to come from, and it all feels played out in public to some degree. And once more, I remember as well, Moonraker having that wonderful scene in the carnival. I think there's a similar scene in a party in Thunderball where it's a sort of street scene, and the assassination is about to take place. And I love when Bond has those moments where he's in a crowd and he has to, everybody else is having a great time, and he's not. He's like, oh, bloody hell,
yes. Yeah. I mean, I thought the Perpignan sequence actually was for me, that was the high point of the novel. I thought that was brilliantly staged. Kind of the way he's chasing Frank, but he's also being chased at the same time, and sneaking and to sneak around and trying to find a post office for the telephone and all this kind of stuff. So, but I thought it was really quite, as you said, I found that quite an exciting. Kind of. I thought the kind of the Scottish bit had its long hairs, as did the plane sequence, really. But there was quite a lot of monologuing going on in them. But the Perpignan one, I thought, was really kind of propulsive and dynamic.
True, I agree that I think you see so to reiterate I'll reiterate to give you a little bit of background about my experience of reading the book. I bought this book when it came out in paperback. I remember the cover, it was
Wow.
like blue cover. I'd read all the Flemings from the original sort of I think second edition pan covers, and I was so um really into Bond, and I couldn't kind of finish this one. But to be absolutely honest, I don't think I ever
Um,
really read any of them all the way through. I think I would read them, I'd read them to like 20 pages shy of the end and then read the last two pages or something. So when I
right.
reread them, it was like, oh, I don't remember this. And I remember the cover being blue, and it was one of those covers that sort of like had bullet holes in it. And when you opened it, it had another picture inside. And the bullet holes went through a rear view mirror, as a side mirror of the Saab. That was the sort of I presume was the Saab. I mean, it could have been any car, really. It could have
We
just
know.
been like
Yeah.
a car that he passed by while firing his gun. Um, so I remember reading that, and I remember sort of getting bogged down quite pretty much when Bond gets bogged down in Scotland. And
Mm.
I rereading it, I kind of liked that element of that being a bit slower and a bit sort of, I don't know about it, but for you, but Scotland gives me this sort of cozy feeling of, and I think Skyfall has that when they go back and it's all misty and we're going back into, and there's this house that they promptly blow up, which you sort of think, I wouldn't mind spending the weekend there. I wouldn't mind getting up in the morning and seeing having a nice breakfast in this sort of house. So that Scottish moment of the book didn't excite me and wasn't as fast paced as some of the rest of the book, but it did sort of give me a sensation that this was something, a part of the book where I could sort of relax in and sort of get
Mm.
into right at the start. So even there, when we talk about pace, sometimes I think it's obviously you don't want to get bored, but it's nice sometimes to have a longer in order to then go into something quicker, you know.
Yeah, no, I see what you mean. It just for me that kind of obviously Bond doesn't really have anything to do
Yeah, he
particularly. He
kind of
doesn't know what's
escapes and
going
then
on.
gets taken back. There's a sort
Back
of
again, yeah, he
yeah,
is captain in this, isn't he? Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. But he doesn't know who Murik is. He doesn't know what the plan is. He's just been sitting there because there's a bit of a hunch about something, really. And so, unfortunately, kind of it does. A couple of times there are very quite extended monologue sequences where Murik basically fills him in on the entire plot twice. I think once is in the plane and once is kind of in Scotland,
right.
and in a sense, it kind of that made me kind of feel as though this opening sequence, the kind of the Scottish castle scenes, were were kind of Gardner trying to fish about to find a way to produce conflict and tension in a situation which hadn't been set up that way.
Mm,
So we know more about what's going on than Bond does, but that
right.
doesn't really produce the tension that you might think it would. Because there's little urgency, really. There's no ticking clock at that particular point. We know something's going to happen, and it's going to be fairly soon. But there doesn't sit. We're not really. And the idea of people taking over kind of nuclear power stations, yes, in the macro, we kind of that might be a fairly terrifying kind of situation. But there's not immediate about that. That kind of for me, it kind of strikes me as being, oh my god, Bond's got to leap into action now. There's a kind of a slight lack of energy, I think, in that
I
in that
I know what
in
you
the,
mean.
in the opening bit.
It's a little bit diffuse, isn't it? It's a little bit like, oh, well, there are quite a few solutions to that wouldn't necessarily involve Bond. There are quite a few ways
Yeah,
we could sort of go about trying to deal with that. And also, it really relies on lots of people obeying what Murik is doing and not necessarily consulting their own consciences or best interests even, if you want to so it's a little bit I totally see what you mean by that. It's a little bit too um it's making the line between the red button and Bond a little bit too far.
yes, because he doesn't know what the red button is either. which I
Right.
think is, kind of, whereas, in most of the kind of the other kind of Fleming novels, there is the kind of sense that we have the villain here, and he knows he's the villain, and there's something going on, and whether that's Smirch or whatever. But kind of, I think kind of here it's just because Bond is just kind of groping about, isn't he? Really, it's literally actually in a couple of scenes, obviously, but there is this kind of sense that he's literally feeling his way.
And there we are again.
Metaphors.
Austin Powers, Austin Powers Jr. has just joined us.
Yeah, exactly. And until he gets to the point where he's kind of puts the bug in the room, and then he hears everything, then doesn't he? And it's all. So I just thought that was slightly clumsy plotting. That kind of a mind, a way of doing that, which was a little bit more interesting.
Yeah, I see. And what do you think of? Well, let's talk about the women in the book as well, because we got Lavender Peacock in one of the sort of major subplots being
Yes.
the great name. Top marks for a completely nonsense name. We also have like Q being substituted by Anne Riley as the who.
Cute.
Oh, God damn it!
That's bad. That's bad.
I know. It really is 1981. I mean, you've got it. Moonraker is still to come. Is it in 1981?
No, it's the 79. So it's the same year as Your Eyes Only. So it's the kind of the back to basics Bond.
Right. Okay. Okay. And For Your Eyes Only was the first Bond I saw at the cinema. I bet you saw Moonraker at the cinema, did you?
I did see Moonraker at the cinema, yeah.
So you saw
I think I might have been...
woman?
Yeah.
Because that's ground zero of sort of Bond sexism in terms of the Moor is that's the line I always go to as my ground zero sexist line.
Which one?
A woman.
So,
yeah, when he's introduced to Dr. Goodhead.
Oh, I see. Yeah, of course.
And as if Dr. Goodhead wasn't enough, it's the fact that he says, a doctor, a woman.
Oh, woman. Yeah. Oh, there's so many of them. They're so egregious. And they kind of, one blends into the other. But yeah, it's odd, isn't it? That whole. I couldn't get out of my head that Bond was actually about 45, and or 50. And so when kind of Lavender Peacock comes along, she's clearly in her early 20s. I thought, oh, James, you got to get out of being such a chicken hawk. This is not so good. It's not a good look. Graying at the temples and the kind of the woman his age, Mary Jane, comes in to seduce him and like, who's this? Woman of my age.
Nora Batty.
Yeah, that's what
with your wrinkled stockings.
Yeah, she's all right when she's got her clothes on, but no, thanks very much. And so he kind of weasels his way out of that. But it was part of that uncomfortableness kind of. Oh, actually, really, he's kind of an older man here, and this is all a bit, it felt a little and insistent as well. Kind of is clearly got an absolutely raging one for her, and doesn't do very much to disguise it really. Getting to bed. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think there is a thing here where Gardner, along with a lot of the writers and directors and people who deal with Bond in the 70s and 80s and beyond, they don't so much want to sort of address the sexism or eliminate it even, heaven forfend. They just want to sort of make the sexism more up to date. They want to sort of say, no, but a man in the 80s still has to be a man, and this is what the ladies will like. I mean, we're going into the 80s where this is going to be the 80s dominated by people like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone, and this sort of hyper masculinity and this sort of like a masculinity that almost has no room for women because it's just so full of muscles and testosterone.
And also one which, because of the kind of the visibility of the body, in Sedgwick's words, it kind of it activates that kind of continuum between kind of homoeroticism and heterosexuality. That kind of that that the visibility of the display of, of not necessarily Arnie so much because he's so enormous, but Bruce Willis or the other kind of action stars of the 1980s, that there is a kind of, I mean, it's completely homosocial, really, the book. And I thought that kind of, in a sense, Mary Jane is there to defer any possibility of thinking that Murik is kind of perverted in some kind of way, either in relation to Lavender or in relationship to Bond. And also Lavender is there also to defray any kind of thing between Murik and Bond, or even Caber, even, because there's that fascinating moment right at the end of when Caber is kind of pushed out of or dies by falling out of the plane, where he looks deeply into Bond's eyes in his dying moment, and it's hatred, it's coded as, but there's moments of deep visceral connection between the two men, which is kind of forged in their wrestling match, of course, in the Highland Games. So the sexual politics are actually quite complicated in this book. I think there's a kind of lots of sleight of hand going on about this idea of masculinity and sexuality. But it's kind of there's a kind of cost about it which needs to be kind of negotiated differently into certain parts of the narrative. And so Murik's made this completely asexual kind of being, this part bird, part bulldog thing, and the whole idea that he might be in a kind of much more predatory relationship with Lavender is taken completely off the table. And so I think it's that again probably says something about the fact that we're in the early 1980s here, but there's a kind of certain little cultural bells are starting to ring, and Gardner's aware of it, but he's kind of doing some juggling to try to kind of keep this out of sight, really.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I was thinking when I read her name, Lavender Peacock, was lavender as a coding of homosexuality, and peacock of vanity, So I mean, one of those names would make you think, well, okay, hang on. I mean, lavender screams to me that this is coding to some degree. But peacock is like coding, is putting a hat on a hat. We've put a very floral hat on a very floral hat, if you like.
Yeah. So we go from Pussy Galore to Lavender Peacock.
Quite.
That's fascinating, really. There's a terrible moment actually when he first sees her at Ascot, where he mentions her impertinent breasts. And it was like, oh, Gardner, what are you doing? What's that there for, really?
Impertinent.
Impertinent. Yes.
I mean, I guess it's tying, it's joining the dots in sort of Fleming's writing style to sort of, buttocks like a boy's, like a small boy's bottom, from Vesper and Casino Royale. And there's this, I mean, look, you don't even have to. If anybody's ever read the screenplay of Taxi Driver, the description of the Sybil Shepherd character in that is quite astonishing in its sort of description. So I think men writing about women, even and including today, it can be sort of, you can start gnawing your head off with how bad it is in terms of the sex scenes and not even, and I would not in any way confine that to genre fiction. I find literary fiction remarkably bad at describing bodies and sex
just
scenes.
Egregious.
I mean,
absolutely.
I especially, I think there's something to be said as well for I mean, this is a little bit of a digression, but who cares? It's my podcast. I don't care. But heterosexuality, especially male heterosexuality, is really poorly served by art sometimes, as much as it seems to dominate art in terms of the voices and the sort of power narratives and whatnot, because it's unwilling to examine itself and really play, excuse me for the pun, but play with itself. Then I'll give you an example. In cinema, you will get lots of scenes in mainstream cinema. You'll get lots of scenes of female masturbation as a sort of form of a beautiful awakening, as a form of self-realization. Male masturbation will always be creepy or comic. It will be American Pie,
Mm.
or it'll be Kevin Spacey in the shower in American Beauty. And the
Mm.
only and you sort of think, well, hang on a minute, that's something we kind of all do quite frequently. Why isn't that being represented in any way which is sort of just
Mm.
varied, has something else?
Mm.
And thank God for queer cinema, because if it wasn't for queer cinema, there wouldn't be any representation of male sexuality that wasn't either creepy or comic. So I find that, so when we're looking at books like James Bond and we're looking at the descriptions of bodies and things like that, it's kind of interesting to read bad versions as a way of highlighting how bad we are at it. How can't we get this right if we're not really, we're, the cliches are kind of giveaways, if you like.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's one of the things that kind of that stood behind this novel when I was reading it was there's a series of kind of quite explicit novels called Man from Camp, were written in the late '60s when the paperback market started to open up in the US to allow more sexually explicit material, particularly for gay men. So these are kind of genre spy novels, pulp essentially, very short, often with very explicit material in them, written by a guy called Victor Banis. And they're pretty good. They're quite funny. Not badly written. Um, but that's kind of that. In a sense, there's lots of things to do with disguise. There's lots of things to do with fluidity. There's lots of straight men who get turned in those books, and there's a kind of joyous kind of celebration of different kinds of bodies and fluidities, and that I mean, this novel could have gone somewhere closer to that. I think, and that side of the possibility, the fact that that you literally doors are opened in the early parts of the novel by Lavender and by Mary Jane, and the Gardner takes the most conventional option,
Yeah.
kind of here. And the abandoned in distress kind of motif and blah 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 blah. And there's really very, and even though he kind of has suspicions of Lavender, I never had any thoughts whatsoever that she was going to betray him or anything like that. Kind of, she just seemed very much a kind of very straightforward, almost cardboard kind of figure, really. But the kind of the fluidities of sexual identification or sexual practice are kind of hinted at. Is Murica voyeur? Does he send Mary Jane to kind of do certain things? Does he enjoy that? All of this is it's just in the weave, but never kind of brought it to anything like an interesting kind, which I think Fleming is much more willing to do, actually. There's a kind of cruelty and sadism in Fleming, which allows him to go a little bit further with certain things.
Mm. That's really interesting, because I think there is an element. So there are these moments. I think you're right. He sort of half opens the door to some really interesting possibilities, but then I can't help but feel, as I was reading the book, that this was being written by somebody who, when he watched films as a kid, went, "Oh, yuck, kissing," and wanted to get on to the next bit. So it's ultimately almost as though he's ticking a few boxes, and it's kind of interesting how he ticks those boxes and what inadvertently kind of gives himself away. It's like, oh, I'll just think of a random sexy sounding name, and I come up with Big Penis Caber Man, and it's like,
exactly.
and it's sort of like, okay, if you sure you want to go with that, yeah. What's wrong with it? It's just random. It's not. I haven't thought about it for even a second.
Well, I think Bond does kick him in the nads a couple of times, doesn't he, in the wrestling match?
He certainly does. He kicks him in the caber.
He does.
One other aspect that I think we can tie without it being ultimately too tenuous, although people might think we've set some tenuous strands aloft already. But one of the things that really seemed to be different here from the Fleming books and from even the films was the violence and the gore. Because it's quite gory, this
At the
book.
end, particularly.
Exactly, yeah. What did you make of that?
Yeah, I was. In fact, you primed me actually, kind of to say that kind of that there's a bit of gore about, and I thought, oh, got towards the end, I thought, oh, where's that? The John misremembered, and then you have the kind of the killings where basically blows someone's head off, kind of, and there's blood all over the place in the plane, and then Kaber gets stabbed and there's blood all everywhere. And then what happens to Murik? Basically, he puts a hole through him, literally kind of he fires this thing. And then he kind of says he kind of thinks later that he might have seen the kind of, a space through
sort of the sun setting back. It's like The Quick and the Dead with that shot where he blows a hole through.
Yeah, exactly. So, I don't know how to process that really. It in a sense, it's kind of like, oh, this is an updated Bond.
Yeah,
the kills aren't clean. You don't just walk away from this stuff. But kind of there's something horrific about taking a life, which I think was kind of quite interesting, really. That kind of, there isn't very much violence up to this point, really. Even the torture scene is kind of done in a hallucinatory way, so you don't get much sense of really what's going on in terms of physical stuff. I mean, it's not. He's not got his knackers underneath the chair being whacked.
You're never going to top that.
No, that's true. How did you read the kind of the gore? I mean, I thought it was.
It almost felt like it was really sensing something in the water of the 80s, that the 80s were or coming out of 70s action films or something, that there was as I've already mentioned, Taxi Driver having an effect on sort of how people are. When's Taxi Driver coming out? Is that
76?
76. Oh, it's way back. So yeah, this is post The Wild Bunch, obviously, and post Taxi Driver. So I had a feeling also that I mean, The Wild Bunch and Taxi Driver are films that are about violence, and so their gore is very much motivated by the themes that they're doing. But then in the 80s, you've got like Beverly Hills Cop 2, ripping someone to shreds with a machine gun in what is really an action comedy. And you've got sort of Walter Hill films, which are 48 hours, where people are blown to pieces by shotguns and whatnot, in the middle of a sort of quip a minute, fairly. I mean, it's a gritty 48 Hours. I think is a really good film.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Much better than the Beverly Hills Cop films, which are obviously ripping off the idea to some degree. So I found the violence. It was almost like it was sensing that was coming down the road, and it's again interesting that the Timothy Dalton film License to Kill will actually be the only James Bond film that's a 15, I think, even to this day, and will include much more sort of bloody violence than has hitherto been played out. With the scene where I think it's Robert Loggia gets sort of pressurized to death in a tank of some kind.
Yeah. Well, David Hedison gets his legs eaten by a shark as well.
Yeah. And don't worry, they grow back apparently, according to several novels. He keeps having the hook on the wrong hand as well, Felix Leiter. Yeah, so
I think you're right about that. I was racking my brain about them and whether there are genre pictures which up the ante in violence in this period. The pattern spy, espionage is not quite in. It's kind of, I suppose, the mode is more le carré, and
right.
Kind of for true espionage fiction, rather than kind of thrillers. But it'd be interesting to put it in that context, wouldn't it? I think I think you're right that kind of there is a sense of a different cultural moment with regard to the explicitness.
I just think there's always a thing with the Fleming Bonds is that he's very explicit about the weaponry, and so what happens to someone when, if you're going to up the ante when it comes to the weaponry, and you're going to describe people having this weapon or that weapon, then when you shoot them with that weapon, the results are different. And they're not going to be as clean as, if you're shooting someone with a Walther PKK, they can sort of clutch their chest and a thin strand of blood can leak betwixt index and forefinger. But here, they're going to be much more, you're going to have grievous bodily harm.
Yes, and with a 9mm Browning. Or he also talks about other weapons that he's carried. I think one involves a kind of 44 Magnum.
Right.
And so we're in dirty territory,
Well, that's a really good comparison, I think.
It does mention in kind of the first, and I do remember Bond in one of the stories carrying this a .25 Beretta, which is a very small, kind of very small pistol with a very light kind of lance. And it's kind of seen as a kind of I think literally called a kind of a lady's pistol or something.
Ladies' gun.
In this, a lady's gun. And so again, we have that kind of post Dirty Harry kind of, which is kind of obviously kind of exaggerated and nonsensical even in its own terms, really. I think the idea of the weapon becomes something, a lethal weapon. And again, another of these more explicit kind of action movies which use violence in a slightly different kind of way. The idea of Bond being the blunt instrument, the lethal weapon, perhaps again is that kind of the more explicitness is kind of called for. I'm thinking also about the way in which the American certification system works in kind of around this period, where, and still does, of course, where the same certificate would allow more violence and less sex in the US, and it's the other way around for the BBFC. And so perhaps kind of Gardner is kind of thinking in terms of that kind of regime, because you don't really have any sex scenes. The only one you have is cut away from it straight away, kind of in the book. But then you do have these very, very explicit, blood, splattering up the inside of the pressurized cabin at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I do think this is an interest. It's interesting to see this book because obviously it's doing two things as a book. It's trying to put James Bond back on the map. It's trying to get John Gardner a job, and it's potentially trying to get itself filmed. I think those are three things it's doing, as well as obviously writing a good book and a thriller and all the rest of it. But within that, remit, he's not writing this as without those things in his mind, I don't think. The fact that he goes on to write 13 more of these books, 14 in total, is obviously sign that he succeeds in at least one of those things. There are many people. This is the only one I've read, but I'm told that Icebreaker, which I think is the third or fourth one, is really well worth, and it's sort of like Bond against neo-Nazis, and that's a really interesting.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. That sort of, again, you're now in a totally different sort of political atmosphere and world. But it's interesting seeing this in terms of as well the sort of the aeroplane going around the Mediterranean and stuff, as that's a kind of quite a cinematic ending and has a good feel to it, and you can see it's very visual. You can see it being made into a film.
Another thing where kind of it's to do with conjuring, because he turns into Houdini. And he kind of performs a bit of escapology, doesn't he? To kind of get out of his shackles.
Yeah.
So yeah. So again, it looks another one of those very nice threads. But you're absolutely right. It is very visual, that, isn't it? That kind of, and you have the jets, and there is this kind of. But I suppose the idea of the kind of the enclosed space, kind of, which is the. Whether that's kind of it allows a kind of manner. No, but there isn't really a mano because Murick's not that kind of character. So you have a kind of an Avatar version with Kaber, but even that doesn't work properly as a kind of full-on, retribution or confrontation between the boss fight, I suppose. In a way.
Yeah, but I mean, you've got to always have the henchman who does the physical. He's the odd job. He's the
odd job, yeah.
And Blofeld will always be, he's going to be maybe shoved out of a window or something, or Goldfinger shoved out a window. It's not going to be a real, as you say, a real sort of fist fight, because it would seem ungentlemanly. It's like that's not in his wheelhouse, whereas it very much is in James Bond's. Also, going
But then
back
then he shoots him in the back.
right, which is interesting, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
Also, actually linking it to something you said earlier as well about the sort of Europeanness of this book, there's a sort of sense of that as well with the circling jets and everything, and people coming in. There's a sense that Europe is actually kind of quite well protected, and there's a sense that there's sort of a cooperation going on, or not cooperation, but an interlocking. There's a European Union if one wants.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's NATO without the Americans in a sense, isn't it? Really, it's kind of it's that kind of sense of and very interesting. Kind of it's one of the power stations is in East Germany, isn't it? It's in the DDR,
Right.
and I thought that was a very interesting thing because it's a hint to that kind of Cold War world, but it's also a hint to that post Cold War world, which is not really on the horizon in 1981, but the idea that Europe is kind of not in flux exactly, but the borders and boundaries of it are kind of going to shift quite soon.
You do get the feeling that there's a sort of a defrosting of the Cold War throughout the Roger Moore Bonds. There's a repeat character who comes in several times, and he's in For Your Eyes Only as well, where it's kind of like they're nominally adversaries, but actually the real adversary is someone else. And when they throw the sort of whatever the MacGuffin is in the Casio,
the X81,
yeah, exactly, the Commodore 64, I was going to say, but when they throw it down the cliff, he kind of shrugs his shoulders and says, "Okay, well, neither of us have got it, so I guess we call it a draw, Mr.
You
Bond."
don't have it. That's exactly. Yeah.
I'll see you.
Comrade.
Exactly, precisely. So let's just look at the reactions which this book had. With the reviews were generally mixed. Philip Larkin reviewed the book in the Times Literary Supplement, and he said it didn't have any life of its own, and it lacked Fleming's compelling readability. Kingsley Amis, his good friend, and of course somebody with skin in the game, having written the Bond book, which immediately preceded this, or not immediately preceded it by a decade or so, wrote that the book was so sodding tame. And Gardner can't write exciting stories. So completely, softening his words, making... Yeah, I think on generally positive as a review. On the balance, quite positive. Yeah, he said later on he modified his opinion to say that the novel was bad enough by any reasonable standard. In other words, he wanted to kick it with his left foot as well as his right.
Good cabering.
Yeah, exactly, right in the nads. There was another listener, Marganita Lasky, who was someone who was a big fan of Gardner's books, wrote in and she's a crime critic, said it was competent, which is a very deadly word to say about anything, and has its funny moments. You see, that wouldn't be my takeaway from this book. I wouldn't think the comedy was... in fact, I think it's kind of quite a humorless book in many ways. It has it has dad joke humor, which is unfortunately without Connery. I mean, I don't know. How do you feel about this, Bri? I feel the Roger Moore books are sort of Roger Moore films, are woefully unfunny. They're just like they're groany funny. If that's the only way you can take them.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's weird, isn't it? To kind of take no, I didn't raise a smile at all throughout this book. I didn't think it was going for that even, really.
No, not even cute.
Oh no.
See what I mean?
No, exactly. You got me there. Yeah.
I mean, Connery can take the most sort of sexist moment in an Ian Fleming book and just make it hilarious. So it's pussy galore. Of course you are. That's all he says,
Yeah.
and
It's about delivery, isn't it?
Plenty O'Toole, named after your father. Named after your father, I assume.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a genuinely funny line from Diamonds Are Forever.
It is.
Named after your father, I presume.
I read that Garner's previous books, which I haven't read at all, that they were kind of better received than some of his Bond ones. Is that true?
Well, he was an established crime writer, and that sort of also makes this career turn something of a dangerous thing for him, because he's sort of very much giving up a career that he's already established and going, and presumably, he's been well recompensed for this financially. But he's going for something which you're kind of on a hiding to nothing. I mean, you're never gonna really. I mean, all of the reviews that I've seen are fairly. What Gardner has failed to realize is that the charm of Bond is as strictly related to a sense of period as that of Sherlock Holmes or Philip Marlowe. Removed from this distinctive environment, Bond is a fish out of water, the glamour shrivels, the self-indulgence becomes apologetic, and the atmosphere seems absurd. That was from let me just see, sorry. That was from The New Statesman, Nicholas Shrimpton. And Shrimpton must know about shriveling. Sorry, that's my Connery. My Connery went off.
Yeah, yeah, what side is that? Is that the dad joke or is that the Connery?
Not sure. Yeah, I mean, all of these are really quite damning. Garden lacks the sparkle of Fleming's truly original plotting and humor. I mean, this is my problem with some of these criticisms, is having read all the Connery, all the Ian Fleming books. I mean, Fleming isn't that great a writer at things like plotting.
Yeah.
It's not. That's not his strength. They are. I will, go to the grave saying they have huge, enormous pleasures to be had. But to sort of, it's sort of almost ironic that these writers who at the time Fleming was publishing the Bond novels would have been equally sniffy are suddenly holding him up as the gold standard. That strikes me as a real irony.
I think it's such an interesting thing that you pointed out, this idea that that Gardner was giving up a particular kind of career to write this book. And then to take on a contract to write, as you say, another 13 more after this one. Because the way that kind of, I suppose, the later continuation novels that you get to us with things like Solo and Devil May Care and those kind of things, is that they're definitely kind of name authors parachuted into, and providing prestige for, kind of the whole idea of the Bond novel. Whereas this is very different, isn't it? It's a kind of a lesser known figure, a genre writer who has been given the job to not make a name for himself exactly, but to literally to be a continuer. And I think that's such an interesting thing to give up. I don't think back on other science fiction novelists of the 60s like James Blish, who went on to who wrote lots of Star Trek adaptations, or quite a few of them, and was excoriated for it. For kind of selling out, or for writing back, or kind of just turning into a kind of commodity. Whereas here the whole plan for him is not to be in Fleming, not to be famous, but to be a kind of handmaiden to Bond. He's the midwife, isn't he? He's not meant to be. He's not meant to be famous author John Gardner. He has to kind of get himself out of the way to put Bond first, in a way.
Yeah, and it's not. I mean, the way somebody like Lee Child or Robert Ludlum's estate have sort of continued with Bourne. They will sort of put Robert Ludlum's Bourne and the name of the actual writer will be sort of like in small print somewhere hidden, or Lee Child using his brother Andy Child as the sort of ghostwriter to the Jack Reacher books. Not I mean, he's credited. They both have their names on the cover. It's not a ghostwriter in that sense, but it is a sort of ghostwriter in the sense of, it's kind of a strange. James Patterson is another who's essentially a factory of novels, and he just has, he's like Michelangelo. He just, not in terms of quality, but in terms of hiring a lot of people to do his work for him.
Studio.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah.
Or Hans Zimmer is another one who just has, hundreds of employees writing music for him, and he'll just toddle in and sort of say, "Oh, have you thought about this as a tune?" And this and this, work on these, and that's why Hans Zimmer does.
I like that bit.
Yeah. That's good. That's not good. And he's very open about the fact that that's how it works. The other figure who will do that in the continuation novels, and someone who I will do an episode on in the future, although I haven't actually read any of his books, is Raymond Benson, who's an American novelist, and he took on he was actually working as a game designer on the James Bond 007 A View to a Kill computer game in 1985. He also wrote something for the role-playing game You Only Live Twice, and he wrote a whole bunch. I think he wrote about 10 novels and several short stories, including some novelizations. Tomorrow Never Dies novelization and Die Another Day novelization. The World Is Not Enough novelization as well. His final book, or sort of Bond adjacent book, was The Hook and the Eye, which is coming out, is in 2025, and it's guess who is the main character of that book? The clue is in the title.
Is it Bond related, did you say?
Yeah.
The Hook and the Eye.
Yeah. We mentioned him before. It's Felix Leiter, baby. The hook.
Oh, is it?
The hook in the eye. See, the hook, because he's been eaten by a shark.
I see. The other thing I noted about Gardner was that he'd also written some Sherlock Holmes kind of continuation stories. I see that in some of the early stuff, particularly with Muir and the way that he was described, the bulldog bird thing. It reminded me a little bit of Conan Doyle, and even going on about brachycephalic foreheads and Moriarty and all of that kind of stuff. There was a kind of, I could see how Gardner was kind of very much had that kind of influence in terms of crime novels as well, as well as kind of so the kind of the Fleming. It's not Fleming impersonation, is it? He isn't trying to do that, which I think is to his credit in a way. Although he does get the tone fairly reasonably, I think. But you can also see these other threads stylistically of other kinds of genre writing, which are actually pretty strong flavours. Kind of in terms of a Bond novel. Kind of having a kind of a Sherlockian thing going on to do with this idea of the master criminal, the kind of the genius, who never really comes into full flower. I mean, Muir is no Moriarty.
No, that's true.
Even though
Yeah,
there's another half pun there.
Absolutely. I was just thinking when you said it. As soon as you said it, it leapt out. And very interestingly, Anthony Horowitz, the other who we've already done an episode on, another continuation novelist. I think he's done 3 in total. A well-established crime novelist in his own right. Also, Sherlock Holmes continuation novelist who's written a book called The House of Silk. I think he's written more than one Sherlock Holmes book. But his continuation books are really interesting as well because they're period books and they're often set in between novels. So it will be like, after The Man with the Golden Gun or just before, in between. One of them is a direct sequel to Goldfinger. So it's like what happened between Bond and Pussy Galore before she went away, and how that relationship ends before it goes into another one. And that one, I've got to remember the title of it. It's the one we did the episode on. It's not a Mind to Kill. That was the okay, it'll come to me later. That one actually includes an original sort of short story by Fleming that was never published, and he uses it as his sort of as part of the book. So it's kind of like it's almost like a Frankenstein's monster of a book where there's a limb from the in there.
Trigger mortis.
Trigger mortis, that's it. Yes, that's it. Forever and a Day is one of the is the other one, and A Mind to Kill.
Yeah, they're all kind of very pastiche titles, aren't they? Actually,
yeah. And none of them quite have. None of them quite. I mean, Trigger Mortis, I think, is quite good. I'd go with Trigger Mortis any day of the week. But it shows you how good Fleming is at turning a title. Actually, that
it is.
License renewed is just like, really, is that all you've got? Is that really?
No, it is.
Thriller.
Yeah.
James Bond book. James Bond book number 2. It feels like a placeholder. And I mean, it's funny that they sort of turned down Meltdown, which you can sort of see, okay, it's not, but it's at least it has something there. If you could put Meltdown into some sort of pun, it would be better. But you can imagine them all sitting around a table going with a book of idioms and sort of, a stitch in death. Too many bullets spoil the broth.
Spoil the day, wouldn't it?
Precisely.
I suppose Meltdown might. I suppose the marketers might have kind of said, "Oh no, that sounds too much like a kind of some cover kind of thriller, or kind of." So maybe it's not Bond enough. Meltdown.
It's almost more, as you say, sort of more. Weirdly, it sort of sounds like something maybe Tom Clancy would write in, later on.
Yes, absolutely.
And what's interesting about Benson writing is he's American as well. So there's that, you have that additional sort of, which of course is no issue necessarily, because most of the Bond films were written by American screenwriters like Richard Maybaum, who was wrote most of
and as we said, kind of earlier on, America kind of just looms so large in the Fleming imaginary anyway, doesn't it? That kind of the idea that Bond can be written by an American doesn't really, it makes perfect, reasonable sense, really, because there is a kind of, obviously, an English associated with Bond, but he's such an international kind of figure as well, and his idiom is so easily inhabited.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's sort of tie up any loose ends that we need to, and give our final judgment on John Gardner's license renewed. Do you feel that the license has been renewed, or do you feel that if you were reading this in 1981, would you be thinking, "Oh, I can't wait to read the next one," or would you be thinking, "Okay, I think we should put this one to bed and leave it alone for quite some time, put it back in the deep freeze"?
Somewhere in the middle of. I think somewhere in the middle. I think it's not a misfire, and I did wonder whether kind of it wasn't going to work at all. I do think it's patchy, but I think kind of for me that Perpignan sequence is so effective and drew me in so strongly that kind of I'd probably give the next one a chance and think because it's his first go at it, kind of maybe he has a slightly different grip on the plotting next time, and so it's not a golden eye, I don't think, in terms of a relaunch.
That's a really good comparison. That's a really good comparison, I think.
But it does kind of go on.
No, I was going to say, using your sort of movie metric, this for me is a Living Daylights, where I think, okay, it's almost like you're trying too hard to sort of, to make it something else while not letting go of the thing. It's you're falling between two stools. I always thought the Timothy Dalton. Yes. I know it's very fashionable to love the Timothy Dalton Bonds now. But I every time I watch them, I just think they they sort of fail at what they're trying to do. They're neither enjoyable Bonds nor are they serious spy films, and so
No,
being
no.
neither.
I mean, I think, yeah. I think the second one, it's License to Kill, the second one, isn't it?
That's right, yeah.
I always see that more as just a very straightforward 1980s thriller.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
it's not really a Bond film in that kind of way. It's certainly not an espionage thriller, but on its own terms, as a kind of, if it wasn't Bond, if it was someone else playing a CIA agent or something, it would work reasonably well as a kind of kind of action movie, which is kind of what it is. I don't think its ambitions are very high, really. That film, it's a very commercial of its moment kind of action movie. I think the Living Daylights could have been a bit more interesting, really. They could have gone. Would you wear Dalton to the sake it was it to make him darker and kind of go push him much closer to Fleming territory. But I think kind of you could say that the Gardner's this book that we have here is one in which you can see how post Fleming and I particularly think with Le Carre, who comes, very seriously into prominence in the 70s, with Tinker Tailor and the two BBC, kind of adaptations, of which I think Smiley's People is 80 or 81. I don't remember which one it is. So it's around the same time this is being written. And the kind of idea of a slightly seedy, decaying kind of world of espionage. It's a bit more like Dayton, where you have this kind of departmental squabbles and people not really getting on with each other and competing for resources and that kind of stuff. But it doesn't go the full way. And so what you end up being is a kind of Bond being on a bit of an island in a way that kind of, which is kind of part of the thing that the 00 section is going to be shut down anyway. But it doesn't really provide him with much of a context because he's no longer part of the old context where he's kind of the instrument of the British Secret Service, because that's all been done, something else has been done to it. But neither is he kind of in the context of really MI5 or kind of other securities, or multiple American securities, kind of apparatuses or European security apparatuses. They're entirely absent, really. So again, I think it's probably, as you said, it falls a little bit between the stools.
Isn't it maybe from a historical context almost as if the Bond is sort of like a post-war consensus figure? We've won the war. To some degree we've lost the peace. Suez has disgraced us. All the rest of it. But Suez happens already, the Bond novels are there. But interesting enough, Anthony Eden goes and stays with Ian Fleming in the middle of the crisis of his prime minister. And, within a month he's resigned. He's popping pills and trying to conduct government from GoldenEye, essentially. And so Bond is sort of like a fantasy figure fueled by that sort of still running on the fumes of the Second World War and the idea that we're all reading warlord comics and are still very triumphant. But by the 80s, by 81, we've had so much of the Cold War. We've had the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've had Nixon. We've had the moral equivalence between the USSR, Afghanistan. All this sort of stuff happening. Which is actually pre-Afghanistan, really. We've not. Bond as a figure no longer he feels like there's no real nobody's really the Cold War is not going to be won anytime soon, and it's not that's not even valid as an idea, nor is it really a danger except through the idea of a nuclear war, which obviously is a great danger but has nothing to do with spies necessarily, because those secrets have gone, they've flown the coop. And a cultural artifact which does a job much better than this, and that's a little bit unfair because this isn't trying to, comes out in 1985, which is Edge of Darkness.
Yes,
and Edge of Darkness
was just repeated on British television this weekend,
right? And that just gets the absolute grimy or an ordinary person in the middle of a worldwide conspiracies to some degree, even though it's and you really get a feeling of, oh my god, this is being done. And 007s and secret agents are not the heroes of this world. And so they're not coming to save us. They're coming to make sure the shareholders of these big government, big companies or these government agencies are going to be protected.
Yes, because actually, kind of thinking about the end of this novel, the the inflated stakes of the nuclear kind of reactors is undone so quickly, where he just kind of says, "Oh, look," and that's all done. There's no issue with that. So really, the stakes are about Lavender and her inheritance. That's what the novel's really all about. Is about Lavender and her inheritance, and those are pretty small stakes for James Bond, really.
Right.
Um, and so in a sense that kind of shows the degree to which the whole world has shrunk.
He's buying a Saab.
He's buying a Saab and making sure some young woman that he knows is going to get her money all right. Yeah, he's like an insurance agent.
Yeah, yeah, he's just fixing stuff. I've got
the man from the Prue.
I've got no problem with small stakes either. I mean, I love Casino Royale as a small stakes thing. It's just, there's a guy who's gambling with, and we're gonna ruin him, and by ruining him, we're gonna take out an agent, and the whole of the thing is one agent.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that I love going back to those sort of small things because I understand them. I understand if I fell off the roof of my house, that's terrifying because I understand what that is. But falling off the Empire State's building, I can't even compute that. The scale is just too extraordinary to think about. So that seems in a weird way less dangerous than falling off the roof of my house.
That's why I think the kind of the nuclear kind of plot in here doesn't really quite work.
Gotcha.
Because the stakes are so exaggerated there that there's and it's diffused so quickly that there's no real urgency, there's no real jeopardy.
You just imagine all those people in all the conspirators are going home, I guess.
Exactly.
Going back to prison.
30 years for you lot. And kind of, yes. Yeah.
Should we blow it up anyway?
How does he save the world? He does it with a phone call. Kind of that's how tiny the stakes are in this novel, really. So I think it's kind of it's interesting because I suppose like a lot of kind of kind of latter day Bond narratives is that idea of the pre-Musk, etc., etc. The idea of the global domination by some kind of rogue genius becomes less and less supportable as a way of thinking about the world because it's much more complicated than that, and everyone knows it's much more complicated than that. But it's very difficult to insert Bond into a kind of all cats are grey world of a Le Carre. You can't because he's not that kind of figure. He doesn't operate in that kind of imaginary.
I mean, it happens right at the very beginning. Once you say we've retired the 00 section, then you've just taken away the entire context for why he exists. If there's not a 006 somewhere and a 008 somewhere, then the idea of 007 just becomes, well, aren't you just like a private killer? Aren't you just you need the authority of the British Empire behind you. And it has to be the British Empire because otherwise we're sending you to Northern Ireland.
Yeah. Well, actually, the logic of it is the logic which is the one that Murik has, which is that Franco has to be got rid of because he's the kind of a cutout in a sense. Really, what would happen to an agent like 007? He'd be killed by the British security services. He'd have to be. There's too much blood in his hand. He knows too much. So some accident would happen to him. He wouldn't be retired or turned into a lotus seeker. That's that. Kind of would be in an unmarked grave somewhere. So that's that kind of sense. I think you're right. What haunts this kind of the idea at the end of the kind of the 00 section is what do you do then with the blunt instrument? That kind of really you have to get rid of him.
Yeah, absolutely. That needs to be the last words M says to him is, "You'll always be my 007."
Yeah.
Oh, M, how could you?
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, or he gets into his cell and there's the guy behind him. He just kind of grots him and he kicks the window out.
Absolutely.
Wow!
What have we done? What have we done? Well, listen, Brian. I hope you can come back and confront another Bond continuation novel at some point in the future. It's been so much fun talking to you.
Yeah, no, I'd line me up whenever you can. That would be perfect.
Brilliant. Take care, man.
Thanks very much. Cheers, John.